There's something that I want to go over just for all my sword mains out there. And y'all are going to be so much smarter after this if you're an avid Dauntless player, because I'm going to discuss with you the sword meta and kind of like how it's derived. And looking at this particular build, I'm gonna slide myself actually over here. Looking at this particular build, I'm gonna ask what is missing from it, right? And I'm gonna actually start with the helmet. And this isn't like something that's 100% confirmed yet, but I am going to say that the meta for the sword is actually the Skullforge. I think it's the play. I think it's the big old play. And if you were familiar with what was missing, it's actually Rage Hunter from the cells here. So we'll go ahead and add those. And what does this build do? If you are familiar with the sword, the combo that does the most damage while in overdrive is repeating elements. And so you might be looking at this and being like, ew, defense slot, but we have the Skullforge. And opting to play with the Skullforge is basically saying that you don't care about stamina and you get to roll whenever you want, you get to spam whenever you want, and within limitation. Now, if you're familiar with using the Skullforge, if you don't have enough damage, you actually don't have unlimited stamina. And so that's what the low life build with Predator allows the sword to do, and that's why it's so strong. It has unlimited stamina and a ton of base damage stats. Just looking at this build, this is pretty much all the damage you could ever want, maybe with like a little bit of attack speed. Now, if you play Dauntless and you look at a lot of builds, and you'll see a lot of builds run Conduit, something like this. But in everyday play, it's actually not very good to be running Conduit 3. And the reason for that is if you're running this in not solo play, you're going to be overriding other players that are using Conduit 6. And there's a luxury here. We have the lovely cell of energized, and I believe that +3 is actually like the sweet spot for energized for the sword, and that's in like very high levels of play. And so we're going to go down the line here and kind of break down this build and why I think it's personally the strongest build for the sword in the game in the current meta. And so let's start with the Inferno's Razor. There are two swords that come to mind, or two weapons that come to mind when a everyday player is looking up information, well versed, and does their homework. And that's the Hellion weapons and the Riftstalker weapons. And now I want to actually mention very briefly that the Malkarian weapons are very good for the same reason that the Inferno's Razor is very good. But we're going to talk about what happens when Riftstalker gets equipped. Watch what happens to the build. Not only do we lose Rage Hunter +6 entirely, we also lose 3 of our overpower that's on the Hellion weapons, like passive. Not only, and then on top of that, we gain the Riftstalker unique effect for the Hellion unique effect, but we also gain a technique slot and a utility cell, which is not 2 power cells, right? Like we lost Rage Hunter outright. And so what do we do here? We have the option, because we have discipline, we could go with 6 Wild Frenzy. That's totally an option. But the play, in my opinion, is to go with Berserker. We have enough attack speed through Whistling Blade and the 3 Wild Frenzy passively that we could even like go full Conduit if we wanted to here, because we have the additional support cell. But if it were me, I would probably test something like this out, like +6 Energize, +6 Predator, +6 Rage, 3 Berserker. This is enough to enable the Skullforge to operate without with minimal stamina loss. We also have 3 Overpower and 3 Wild Frenzy to help with additional damage. I'm leaving the defense cell completely blank just because you can put honestly whatever you want in it. Now, this is what the build looks like with the Riftstalker sword, and you can see how much of a difference it is not having Rage Hunter and losing 3 of that Overpower. So we're losing 30% damage from not having Overpower on top of the 40% from not having Rage Hunter as well. So our damage ceiling is significantly lower, but we have gained the consistent damage of the Riftstalker unique effect. In my opinion, I think that with Whistling Blade and the amount of attack speed that we have, I think that the unique effects are very, very close to even. It really depends on what you're fighting. And there are very few instances where the weapons are actually competing against each other. Most of the time, you already know which weapon you're going to use, especially when you're doing something like Trials, where the element of the behemoth is kind of what you play your build around, right? If you're fighting Pangar, there's 0% chance you're running Riftstalker. If you're fighting Reza, there's 0% chance you're running Hellion. And vice versa. The only time that they compete against each other is when you're running a neutral behemoth like Quillshot, which is the next behemoth coming up. And there are things to factor in, like fire, elemental procs. You know, Umbra weapons don't have like a damaging proc. They just typically have like very strong damaging unique effects. So these are things to consider when you're doing your trial builds. Now, let's talk about something a little bit more general, which is like a low life build in general. The low life build is considered meta just because of the ability to run perks like Rage, which is passive damage. You know, it's just like an extra damage perk that is always up that you don't need to worry about. It's just passive damage, always on. But the big thing, and this is something that's kind of a sleeper to some, because I know for a fact there are some people that will watch this and they haven't been using their tonics, and they don't know what they do, and they don't know how to use them to an effective capacity. So let's read them and hopefully get you a little bit more well versed in why these things are so cohesive together. When you're running a low life build, the main thing is that it allows the ability to bring blitz tonics and use them to an effective manner. At 50%, I believe that just leaves you at 20% attack speed as opposed to like 10. And that's a lot of extra damage, especially when you're running something that's heavily based on number of hits, like the Hellion weapon, and something like Avenging Overdrive, where the number of hits that are being output really affects how much damage you're putting out. Attack speed is something that this build actually doesn't have a lot of with the Hellion Blade, right? We opted to go Energize 3 as opposed to Conduit 3, even in a solo trials environment, because we have Whistling Blade that gives us additional attack speed, and we know that we're bringing the Blitz tonic. On top of that, we have the Rage Hunter with the Frenzy tonic, which is just a flat 15% increase for a minute, but when a behemoth enrages, it goes up to 30%, and so that's just a lot of damage. Aether Drive tonics were the best tonic in the game until the Etheric Attunement nerf. Sorry, I'm having trouble speaking. So Aether Drive tonics were the best tonic in the game. With Etheric Attunement and an Aether Drive tonic, you are effectively having plus 12 Etheric Attunement. Now, if you think about it, our gear, the current build that we are using now, we have effectively, with the Skullforge, we have a stamina tonic. If we weren't using the Skullforge, I would probably run a stamina tonic, and this means that we get to spam more slicers, and that's where we want to be. We're trying to effectively increase the amount of Avenging Overdrive uptime and the amount of slicers coming out. We're just trying to minimize the downtime of Avenging Overdrive, to put into easier terms, and that's how you're supposed to play the sword. The best way to do that is spamming repeating elements outside of overdrive in order to get back into it. Now you can run stamina tonics, you could run Aether Drive tonics, but then you're gonna run into the issue of running out of stamina. You're not gonna be able to roll, you're not gonna be able to spam. An opening might last longer than your damage is able to put out, or like your stamina bar can hold out for. And so that's why I think the Skullforge is very, very strong here. And so you're basically, the Skullforge enables you to run the Aether Drive tonic, which is very, very good for spamming Lantern, which is additional damage. And then we also have the low life build, which enables another damaging tonic in Blitz tonics. And Frenzy tonics are just kind of staple because they, 30% damage when a behemoth is enraged. Stacks very well with Rage Hunter and just a build like this in general. Lastly, I want to point out like Lantern choices. And in a build that's not running the Skullforge, I would say that the Pangar Shine is very, very good because it restores 25% of your maximum stamina. It's very good when you need it for a clutch roll and you're out of stamina, or you just need to extend the damaging window of like an overpower window or something. Like say you just interrupted something but you don't have a lot of stamina and you need to get some slicers out. This is great. And for the most part, I would say that the Emberbane's Rapture is probably the better Lantern here. Just because the hold deals a lot of really nice damage and it's AoE and in a full circle, that will help you with killing like some of the ads that come out in trials. But you could totally get away with Draft's Eye. I've been using this Lantern for a very long time. The 30% increase, I find it's hard to use. I find myself debating a lot where I'm just like, I don't know if I should use the damage window here because I might get a bigger window elsewhere. So if you're able to really recognize where the damage window is going to be, you'll find yourself much better off with the Draft's Eye, in my opinion. But the Emberbane's Rapture is a little bit more of like a surefire. You can just pop it and you get a lot of hits in, and then that kind of like snowballs you further into Avenging Overdrive. So personal preference there. If you're not using the Skullforge, Pangar Shine, probably the way to go. A lot of damage. I think it's the Lantern that deals the most damage so long as the behemoth remains in the pillars, which is really good with the Aether Drive tonics in terms of synergy. I believe that's the last thing I want to cover. We covered the weapon and why it's the Inferno's Razor. As a quick note, the Cyclonic Fury falls under the same sort of deal because you can get Rage Hunter back with the Prismatic Cells, and you can also bond with your sword of choice. You could bump your Energize up to +6 and have a crazy meter gain, which is what I personally go for, but I know there are people out there that will live and die by the Draft's Blade. But that's a personal preference, and a lot of the sword meta stuff has kind of just come to light because the sword has increased in popularity. The sword's a really great weapon. I highly recommend picking it up, and hopefully this sheds some light on some of the meta.